Welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. In the last episode, we talked about our frozen republic and how, to our detriment, it has not been improved upon in over 230 years. It was designed to be an unbreakable contract between Americans, protecting sectoral rights and the individual accumulation of wealth and property. The slavocracy wanted protection from the intrusion of the North. They did not want their lavish and profitable lifestyles interrupted. Their constitution, the Southern planters in particular, was to remain fixed. It was never meant to be changed. We also discussed some of the reasons why our Constitution has become even more rigid over the past century. I'm going to continue the discussion today about our American political system with Dean Stephen Taylor on his book, A Different Democracy, a comparative study of the American political system with other, more modern and more effective democracies from around the world. This kind of comparative analysis, you might suspect, would be common, but on the contrary, it is actually quite rare, even within the broad spectrum of political science. The American system of government is thought of as exceptional, and as such it is studied in its own distinct light, apart from other democracies around the world. Not only did our Constitution prove victorious in World War II, it also gave rise to the post-war boom and the great middle class, or so it seemed. America was prosperous and thriving, infused with the spirit of victory while other nations struggled to rekindle their devastated homelands by creating new and more effective democratic governments. America sank into another constitutional coma. We turned our backs on the kinds of constitutional changes that would empower the democratic spirit in America, as if the economic spirit was all that mattered. And we remained captured by a political system no living American would think logical in today's world. There are many democratic institutions and dynamics which could make our government much more effective and fully democratic. Those more democratic institutions, however, are completely dismissed by organizations like the National Constitution Center and the American Constitution Society. Many of our best constitutional scholars seem either uninformed or dismissive of the democratic achievements of the 20th century in Europe and elsewhere. To them, the American Constitution has some kind of immortal standing. It cannot be challenged, even with empirically established facts. The concept of American exceptionalism is a big topic, and I'm not sure I can get through the first chapter of A Different Democracy in 1 hour, let alone the entire book. But to put us on the trail and to set our minds to the hunt is Stephen Taylor, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Troy University in Alabama. He is also co-author, along with Matthew Shugart, Bernard Groffman, and Aaron Lippard, on A Different Democracy, the American Government in a 31-Country Perspective. Welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
I've been so anxious to have this conversation too, ever since I've known Aaron and his work. It's been more and more clear to me that our perspective of our political system is very constrained. Americans don't really have a global perspective of their constitution and their political system. You preface your book by saying it is often said that the United States has an exceptional democracy. What can you tell us about this perception Americans have of their constitution?
Sure. So, as we point out in the book, I think it's not unusual really for any particular set of citizens to think their country is in some ways special or exceptional. And so it's not surprising that the United States has citizens who think that about their constitution. And you look on one level, right? There's some ways in which this is true. The U.S. Constitution was, depending on how you want to talk about it, one of the first, if not the first, constitution of this type. It created a number of innovations politically, basically created presidentialism and federalism, and a variety of other sort of institutional innovations. Its longevity is largely exceptional, as we point out in the book. And so there are things that one could say, yes, there are remarkable, noteworthy things about the U.S. Constitution. It's also true that we tend to have, I think that the isolation of the United States geographically, right? We're a continental country. We only share borders really with two other countries. Obviously we could make arguments about how we share with the Caribbean, but nonetheless, it's Canada to the north to Mexico to the south, and we are isolated and we're large. And we tend to have a fairly narrow focus on ourselves because of that. We don't really partake of an exceptional amount, no pun intended, of international news, unless it directly affects the United States. If one watches or reads mainstream media, forget anything to do with maybe more niche media, it's really focused on the United States. And if we talk about the abroad, it's about immigration as it affects the United States. It's about foreign policy activities as it affects the United States. I mean, one really great example, if there's an international incident and there are deaths, we often focus only on the Americans who died, not on the other people that died, right? So, I mean, it's sort of ingrained in the way we think about these things. And when we learn about American government, we often do it in a very narrow way, right? As we talk about in the book, political science itself does this, right? Political science walls off American politics as a key subfield within political science, and then creates comparative politics, which is basically the rest of the world. So if, like myself, you're predominantly a comparativist, you learn about and study about the world in a theoretical construct, and a series of theoretical constructs that are related to multiple countries and how that informs our understanding of, say, legislative behavior, electoral systems, executive power, policymaking in general. Even if you study one country, you tend to do it within a context of a theoretical framework that is comparative. And not to start a fight with my Americanist brethren and sisters in political science, the bottom line being that the Americanists tend to study only the American presidency or only the Congress. They do so, and their comparisons are internal to those behaviors. And I do believe that then leads to the way we end up writing high school textbooks. I know it's the way we write college level textbooks in American government. It's very much focused on this is the American experience. And so I think all of that contributes to a mindset that this is just the way that that's how they work.
I can see that. It came out in a previous episode where we were saying a post-war boom was a time of exuberance and growth, expansion of the middle class. And it seemed like America had found itself in the global economy and leaped out ahead of all the other countries. So in that sense, America was exceptional. It's become, the world's superpower.
Yes.
That's an exceptional position.
Yes.
But I would like to distinguish, though, between the economic realities, which are also quite desperate in many respects. You have the wealthy and the poor in this country. You had the boom of the 50s and 60s and the middle class and all of that. That's very true. But in terms of the democratic functioning of this country, I feel like that's something that people can appreciate as being rather dysfunctional and not so exceptional.
Right. So I think, you mentioned the post-war era, and while this isn't really the scope of what we talk about in the book, but the reality is the Cold War itself and the U.S.'s sort of status as one of two superpowers in a bipolar system made it sort of the leader of the quote-unquote democratic West, right? And because we were the richest, and we were the most powerful militarily, and we did things like put a man on the moon and all this kind of stuff, I think it reinforces that notion of exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. And also, if you go through sort of the evolution of democratic governance in the world, right, in the post-World War II period, we have a lot of still authoritarian governance in the world in the 60s and in the 70s. And really, it's not until the 80s, depending on how, really it's in the mid 70s, the third wave of democratization begins in places like Portugal and Spain and moves into Latin America and other parts of the world. But if your mindset is sort of derived from education and thinking about the world during the Cold War period, you see the U.S. as being at the sort of leadership position of democracy. But what doesn't really happen during that period, and certainly doesn't happen subsequently, is that we're just not good at making comparisons. To my long-term friend and co-author Matthew Shugart and I have lamented for decades now that when you read the American press about elections in other countries, they just don't understand how those elections work. They don't understand anything beyond single-seat plurality elections, and they just can't write about it appropriately. It even affects people you would think would know better, like the BBC, but they can rally sometimes and write appropriately. But it really is, because it's complicated, right? You try, I've been writing for years, I've blogged for years, and it is really difficult to make those connections sometimes because the concepts they're complicated, and you have to break them out of a paradigm, right? Their paradigm is so focused on the way the U.S. works that you have to kind of get them to step back and look that it can work differently, and differently can be better, differently can be worse, but still just to have the concept that it doesn't always work this way, the way we're used to, is difficult to get people to see, because it becomes all natural, quote unquote, right? This is just the way things are.
Yeah,
that's when we say in the introduction, and it always strikes me if you have this conversation about American exceptionalism, on the one hand, we think we are exceptional, meaning different, but when we talk about the rest of the world, we almost assume that they're just like us and do think just like us, which means we're not exceptional if that's the case. But it's kind of a weird kind of dynamic, right?
Yeah, I talked to some people locally here who are into politics and organizing and working for the Green Party, for example. And they don't quite understand or seem to understand that you need to have proportional representation in order to get a multi-party system going. I mean, and I've read about Diverger's law, and I know that Arendt has said that you have to take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, you do.
But essentially, when you have winner-take-all elections in plurality elections like we have, single-member districts, they tend to produce a two-party system, right?
Yeah. So single-member districts with plurality elections at least create a tendency towards fewer parties, and proportional representation tends toward more parties. Just in particular, to speak of a way that we truly are exceptional, is that primary elections even exacerbate this, right? Because primary elections mean that we assume that a political actor wants to be elected to office. We assume that's what they want. Why they want to be in office varies. Maybe it's because they want to make laws, and maybe it's because they want to steal stuff. It doesn't matter. They want to get into office, right? So the easiest way to get into office in the United States is to be a nominee of either the Republican or the Democratic Party. And really, depending on the district you live in, you can figure out kind of which party you need to be nominated in. A third party route is it's suicide politically, right? Why would if I'm a kind of conservative leaning libertarian type who really wants to be a libertarian, but my district is 60% Republican, I should run in the Republican primary, which is a relatively low threshold, low cost entry point into politics. And then all of a sudden, if I can win that nomination, and the primary may only have a turnout of 12% in the district, then all of a sudden I'm the Republican nominee, and I can get elected in that district because, again, whatever number I said, 60, 65%, are already going to vote for me because I've got an R by my name. So the third party route is it's almost, again, occasionally it works, but it's really the rarity that underscores that it really doesn't work, right? I mean, we made a big deal about Ross Perot and Jesse Ventura, but that was decades ago, right?
Yeah.
And so really what I just described in some ways was Ron Paul when he was running for Congress in Texas. He couldn't win as a libertarian, but he could win as a Republican. And you can go down the list.
There was Jill Stein, and then Bernie Sanders more or less figured it out, and he joined the Democratic Party.
a great example, right? Because Bernie is still in the Senate. He's still, quote unquote, an independent. But when he wanted to run for president, he ran for the nomination of the Democratic Party within the primary structure. Right. I mean, Donald Trump's a great illustration of this, right? Donald Trump was a theoretically nonpartisan entity who had given money to both parties and was kind of almost apolitical until he got involved in the birther movement back during the Obama administration. He just sort of pontificated about whatever he wanted and went on David Letterman and got made fun of. And then he decided to get involved in politics. But how did he get there, right? He got there because there's a porousness to our parties, and the porousness is at the primary, the nomination stage. While it's true now that the Republican Party seems to be fawning all over Trump and wanting to assuage voters that like Trump, the reality is if you could go back in time to 2015 and put Republican elites in a room and ask them, do you want Donald Trump to be your nominee? They would have said no.
Yeah.
But because of the nature of the primary process, the way we allocate the delegates, the number of candidates that ran that year, and a variety of other factors, now, all of a sudden, not only is he the nominee of the party, he becomes elected president because of another institutional oddity, the Electoral College, and then becomes the head of the party. Because at that point, he's the closest thing to a leader that we have. We talk about our parties as having leaders, but really it's the president or the nominee of the party that has a great deal of influence over the way the party behaves.
Obviously, we're seeing that play out right now. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's incredible.
And just like if Bernie had been nominated by the Democrats, that would have shaped the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
But that shows, again, a truly exceptional thing about American politics. There's no place on earth where that mechanism like that exists the way it exists here. Parties are much more limiting. I mean, there was a great example in the UK a couple of years ago now where some members of the Conservative Party voted against Boris Johnson on Brexit, and he kicked them out of the party that day. They were stripped of their conservative labels. They were then independents in the House of Commons. And if they wanted to run again for Parliament, they were going to have to run as independents. They could not run as conservatives. That's a wholly different kind of dynamic, right? I was just writing a post this morning. This whole question of number of parties came up in a conversation. Somebody kind of got irate with me because I said that even though we have lots of parties in the U.S., technically, we really have a two-party system. I mean, there are like 25 parties that ran for Congress in 2020, but they got combined like 2.5% of the vote or something. So we can't talk about them as being viable parties. So I started to write this post. And this morning I was looking at the German system, and, the alternative for Germany is this right-wing nationalist party that emerged. Well, in the U.S., the right-wing nationalists have now been able to get a substantial toehold in the Republican Party, right, because of primaries. MTG in Georgia, Taylor Robinson, or, people like Matt Gaetz or whatever, or Gozar, they're able to win primary elections. But in Germany, they had to form their own party because the CDU and CSU were not going to let them dominate their candidate lists. So these dynamics matter in terms of how it affects, global politics or national politics.
One thing that you did bring up also regarding primary elections is that you can win a primary election by a very small subset of voters. And so it's really not a democratic process to begin with.
No, well, that's the irony, right? I mean, it sounds democratic, right? It sounds very democratic. And there was a moment in time when I would have probably made that argument, right? Because what are you doing? Well, you're opening up the nomination process to a broader vote of the population, different than, say, the traditional smoke-filled rooms that get talked about in American government textbooks. And that doesn't sound very democratic. But I've become persuaded over the years that what we need and what most representative democracies have, parties are signaling devices, right? Because people don't have the time or the interest to research everybody and every candidate. It's not viable. Now, some people will claim that they do, and more power to them, but most people don't. Most people, if they're honest with themselves, substantially choose their voting outcomes based on the label by the name. Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Green, that's your signaling device to tell you what roughly this person probably believes and roughly how they'll behave in office. Now, often that's may not be true, but it typically is fairly true. I think even people who say that they only vote the person, not the party, if they really look at their voting record, they probably mostly vote the party. It's like when we look at polling on people who call themselves independents, they tend to be very heavily leaning and voting one party than the other, even though they identify as independent. The bottom line, though, being that this party label is really important. We had a system where the parties were truly represented what they say they represented. Then we would have a vote for what policy options we prefer. And that actually is more democratic than some very small slice of the electorate that happens to show up on primary day to choose the candidate, especially in our system with single seat districts where most of the districts are not competitive. So what happens, as I sort of alluded to before, right? You may live in a heavily Democratic district. It could be 70% Democratic. That means whoever gets nominated in the Democratic Party is going to win. They could be a lunatic. But if they get nominated, they're probably going to win. And there are exceptions, right? A great exception that comes to mind is the state in which I reside, Alabama, right? A couple of years ago, we had a special election because Jeff Sessions was appointed Attorney General. So we had a special election for Senate. Roy Moore was one of the candidates and Doug Jones was the other. It's a heavily Republican state. Under normal circumstances, the Republican would have won the race. He barely lost to Doug Jones because of revelations about his behavior, stalking young women in malls in Gadsden, Alabama back in the day. So, but that's really unusual. And it was still very close. And it took things like Senator Shelby saying, well, I'm not going to vote. But that's really unusual, right? Mostly it's if you get Michelle Taylor Greene is the example, right? I mean, it's a heavily Republican district. It was an open seat. She spent the most money in the nomination stage, which typically at that point, it's what sign did I see the sign? Okay, that sounds good. I guess who am I voting for again? Oh yeah, that's the name that I saw. And I checked that box. Plus the percentage of voters is quite low. Then all of a sudden you've got basically a QAnon person in the House of Representatives because of the way this process works. Again, if you had a real system of choosing candidates that represented the party, these days you may argue that she is representative, but I think that even so, I don't think that's really what the mainline Republicans want is QAnon. They would choose someone different. But at this point, now she's entrenched, right? And will probably have a very good chance of being reelected because incumbents in those circumstances tend to be reelected.
Wow, you bring up a lot of good points in that. One of them is that the primary system that we have really is undemocratic. It kind of sucks. And Aaron Lippert was saying the same thing. He would prefer the smoke-filled rooms of yesterday to the primaries that we have going on now, right?
Yeah, because, and that's what you see in the UK, right? So you get parties get formed because they can't break in to the conservatives and the Labour Party. They have to form their own party. Right. And they may not do very well in the election, but at least the voters know what they're voting for. Like, again, like the Tea Party faction or, whomever, the Social Democrats that are within the Democratic Party, they have no reason to make their own parties, right? Right. They want to reside in that cocoon of those clear pathways to the ballot, right? Mm-hmm. And those clear pathways to office. Why tinker around on the edges when you can get elected? It's like two superhighways versus these country roads, right?
Right. In this system, for sure, that's the only alternative that you have. But in a multi-party system, if you had, 10 parties in America, then people would be able to identify more clearly with whatever party most likely represented them.
That's correct.
And the point being is that if there were multiple parties, you would get more people participating because they would want to be represented in a legislature that was designed to have mixed member proportionate representation. They would have a say in government.
Right. Yeah, I would certainly advocate for basically just on a purely empirical, but also in a normative way. I think if democracy is going to function, then you need to have ways by which the voters can, as clearly as possible, and it's never perfectly clear because everyone has different reasons why they vote, but some greater clarity at least than we currently have. Because a binary choice is very difficult, right? You really only have two choices. And to pick an example, so if I really am a staunch pro-life religious conservative, what choice do I have, right? You can argue that I have a choice, but if that really is my issue, then I'm probably going to vote Republican, and I'm going to ignore or rationalize other things I don't like, right?
Right, exactly.
Same with, if I'm left somewhere, an issue that really is important to me, then I just have to find a way to make it work, right? Or I don't vote.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I vote third party because I want my sincere preference to be registered in some way, but that may satisfy when I check the box, but it doesn't really affect the outcome. In fact, it could be to my detriment, right? Because if enough of us vote our own preference, then and this gets to Duverger's law to a point, right? That if I'm a green person, and it's a tight race between the Republican and the Democrat, and I vote green and not Democrat, because really that Democrat's too corporate for me, I may, in fact, take enough votes away from the Democrat that the Republican wins. That's even worse for my preference, at least, in that scenario, than if I had voted Democratic. I mean, and so, which is why most people do end up voting in the two pools, because it's just as close as they can get to what they want.
Yeah.
They don't really necessarily have their full choice. And multi-party systems would theoretically provide that.
Yeah, and it's incredible, too, and I think that, okay, if we just changed our electoral system to include some form of proportional representation, two things would happen immediately, and that would be that we would end gerrymandering, and it would essentially lead to a multi-party political system. So, so that ought to be everyone's, I guess, primary objective at this point. If you want to have a more democratic America, one that's functioning and more effective, the priority would be to establish some form of proportional representation throughout the country.
If I could pick one reform, some form of proportional representation would be my fundamental preference in the House. Now, we can talk about other sort of issues that make democracy difficult, or truly represent democracy difficult in the United States. But yes, right now, it is possible to manipulate the boundaries. You mentioned gerrymandering, so you can manipulate the boundaries in a way that aid one party or the other, which is politicians choosing their voters instead of voters choosing their politicians, which is, in my mind, antithetical to democratic governance. It's also true that it's impossible, and while I certainly would prefer, if the choice is between partisan line drawing and nonpartisan line drawing, I would prefer nonpartisan commissions. The reality is, and this is very important, and most people don't fully grasp this, it's impossible to draw truly fair lines, because any line you draw by definition is going to be biased in some way. I don't mean that in a necessarily partisan way, but a bias is different. It's like a bias sample in polling. You can't draw the lines in a totally neutral way. It's not possible. And part of the problem is that the main divide is rural urban, and because of concentrations of populations, it's very, very difficult to try to parse it out. I'm not even sure it would be even quote unquote fair if all the districts were 50-50. I mean, it sounds like it'd be fair, but if the country's not 50-50, then it doesn't reflect necessarily what the voters want, right? Because it's possible now.
Yeah.
And I believe it last happened in 2012 for the national vote to be for one party and the other party had the majority of seats. There's all kinds of problems with our system. And that's one of them, a spurious majority, as they say. Proportional representation eliminates sort of gerrymandering as an issue. Is therefore a pure expression of representation. Granted, the devil's in the details. How do you do it? What method do you adopt? How proportional is it, and all that kind of thing. But
right.
Our current system is 18th century technology. I don't want a well in the backyard. I want pipes and water and clean water. But to your point about sort of our exceptionalism debate, the way we look at it in the United States, we venerate the past for some reason with this particular thing. We want the brand new iPhone as soon as it comes out, and whatever else the case may be. But when it comes to governing technology, we're less prone to want to see the advantages. But again, I think part of it boils down to we really don't have a frame of reference, right? Not to belabor this analogy, but part of why we end up wanting the new iPhone, right, is our friend hands out their iPhone and shows us the cool new things the new one does, and then all of a sudden we want it. Well, yeah. We don't fully grasp how cool, say, this is a nerdy thing to say, right? How cool the German electrical system is, because we don't really know how it works. It's something that happens over there.
Yeah, I think Steve Jobs said something like, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. I've mentioned this a few times. I have a model of modern Constitution for the United States online, and it incorporates all the recommendations that Arendt has made, right? And I've looked at about 25 other constitutions around the world to look for very democratic features and dynamics that they also include, and have tried to bring them into the model as well. So because my belief was that people needed to look at something to understand what a modern constitution would look like for the United States. I mean, and it's frightening to think that we might change our constitution. Most people are very happy with the devil they know.
Yes.
So here we are, and we're going to be stuck with this thing until people can actually see something that tells them, oh, well, that's something that I could get behind, because it's going to get rid of the two-party system, or it's going to end gerrymandering, or somehow the president's not going to be able to rule the world for 4 years, and then everything gets flipped on its head again when we have another election.
Right.
It was a sort of a tortured beginning at best for our country. So I think at this point, anything more modern than what we have now would probably be better than what we have.
Yeah. It probably would be better. I mean, the issue becomes, and you sort of alluded to it just then, and you insisted along these lines earlier, that if we want a system that does this, that, or the other thing, that does with a two-party system or whatever, I think the problem is that there are many people who do not want the system to change. One, there's the entrenched power of it all, right? I mean, there are certainly groups that benefit from the system as it currently is designed. That's part of it. And another part of it is even people that may not be benefiting from it are still convinced that it can be made to work to their advantage eventually.
Right.
The behavior of many Democrats in Congress right now is of a party that thinks, well, if we can't accomplish our goals now, we'll be able to do it in a couple of years. But the reality is they may not be able to accomplish it in a couple of years. It may in fact be some number of years before the Democrats have anything approaching control. And control I use loosely, because control of the Senate is a very elusive thing. In particular, but they have control over the two houses of Congress and the presidency. It could be, I don't know, I haven't sat down and done the math myself, and things change, of course, but I mean, and just the way we tend to rotate things somewhat naturally, it could be some time before the Democrats have this kind of majority again.
Yeah, it could be quite a while.
It could be quite a while.
You talk about control of the Senate. Well, we technically do have control of the Senate, but Joe Manchin comes along and suddenly the entire infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better bill, is no more.
Right. So, between the way in which the Senate functions, with only certain things that can be passed with a majority vote, and then the way in which the Senate represents is the main problem. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it makes it very, very difficult for anybody to govern, really. Mm. And we really haven't, I mean, even simple things. You look at budgets and the debt ceiling and the various things that become...
All of it. Climate change, gun control. I mean...
No, of course. If you get into the major topics, it's almost impossible. My point being that even just keeping the government open, which you'd think would be a low-level kind of activity, is something that becomes a crisis on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult just to do basic governance. And many of the calls for the president to govern via executive order is troubling, because on the one hand, I understand sort of the frustration that drives the requests, but the more the Congress is dysfunctional, the more the executive is called on to act unilaterally. The more the executive acts unilaterally, the less democratic our governance is. I mean, this is the problem that Juan Lentz talked about back in the 80s about parliamentary and presidential systems in Latin America, where he saw dysfunction in Latin America and breakdowns of democracies in many cases, because the president would assert more power and the Congress was inert. The U.S. was considered an exception to that, to go back to that word, at the time he wrote that article. But that was partially because of the way the parties were aligned, where there was this big chunk of Southern Democrats who were more conservative embedded within the broader, larger Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. They could negotiate internally and they could govern. Mm-hmm. That's gone now. We have these sort of very polarized parties They're sorted ideologically. And then, to get back to the design question, our system is designed in a way that it is easy to stop things from happening. It's easier to stop governance than it is to govern. That's the design of the system, right? We talk about veto gates and veto players and who has keys and who doesn't. And our system is very, very difficult to navigate, and therefore is prone to gridlock or to simply just dysfunction, really. And that's, I think, the fundamental problem.
Yeah, that is. It's as if the framers wanted to design a system where not much could change or not much could happen.
Well, I mean, as we talk about in the book, and I think it's kind of important, right? So Madison thought that he had a different theory of representation, right? That his theory of representation had to do with factions and these factional balances, and that factions were more, he thought they would be more so that on taxes, this group of legislators might be together in a faction, but then on trade, it might be a different group, and it would be more amorphous. They didn't fully understand parties the way they come to develop, and parties are essential for representative democracy, and they're essential for legislative democracy, and they do become these sort of very important institutions. And our system doesn't really handle the party thing very well, ironically enough. And that's part of the problem. I think, too, when they talk about democratic responsiveness or democratic accountability, it's very difficult for the population to know who's responsible for things not working, right?
So complicated.
Is it the majority in the House? Is it the Senate? Is it the president? I mean, part of the reason why we end up seeing, and there are various reasons why we do, presidential parties tend to lose seats in the midterms is because, well, who else are you going to blame? I mean, you just elected he promised the moon, the stars, and the sky. We barely got a blinking light, and therefore it must be the Democrats' fault or the Republicans' fault, as the case may be, right? So, yeah. And that's all, again, a great example of design. I mean, it really is in some ways. It's problematic that we only have these 2-year terms. So a Congress is delineated by a 2-year period, which is not that long, especially in the modern era. And it also means you get different electorates, right? The electorate that shows up for a presidential election is the largest that we get. And the midterms shrink down, and they grow and they shrink. So you get sort of different groups of voters, which, on one level is the voters' fault. That people don't show up, it's their own fault. But by the same token, the way you design things affects behavior. And that's the part that we don't always want to acknowledge, whether it's we talk about why people don't necessarily want to change things, to say, well, if we all just did the right thing, it would all be fine. Well, but the structure affects our behaviors, and that we don't come to full terms with. I mean, I always get frustrated sometimes with the way in which things get covered. So, there was this big thing in Virginia because the Terry McAuliffe lost the governor's race. How could it be? The question is, how could it be that a state that voted X last year for president votes Y for governor? It doesn't make any sense. It must mean that the world's coming to an end for the Democrats. Well, the answer is a little more straightforward than that. You've changed the group of voters by having the election when you have it, right? If you'd had the election if the governor's race in Virginia had been in November of 2020, McAuliffe would have been reelected.
Got it.
But by having it a year after, there's a pattern. I went back and looked. It's kind of fascinating. And I think McAuliffe is the only one. I could be misquoting this. But you go back decades. McAuliffe did win last go-round that he won the election. It was an off year, and the president's party won. But it's almost always the case, regardless of the party, but the other party wins the governorship in Virginia. But again, why? It's if your party lost in November, you're more motivated to go vote because you're upset. If things aren't going well, now you blame the party that's in the White House. And so it changes who shows up. And a lot of people that showed up to vote in November didn't show up to vote in November 20, didn't show up in 21. It's just the way it works.
There's so many complications about this system, and Aaron pointed that out. He was saying it's so complicated in California. He has like 40 elections that he has to take part in.
Yes. Yeah.
nobody really is going to know who to vote for if it's that complicated, if there are that many issues. And then the other thing is that there's two things about our system that I really don't like. One, there's it's continually campaign season somewhere.
Yeah, that's true.
So we're always there. And then the other thing is that it's always about the horse race. You don't really hear that much about the issues. I blame the media for that, but really they focus on the horse race, not really what the candidates want to do or accomplish. So you might get wind of it from time to time that they're more or less, maybe a conservative candidate or an independent or what, but you don't really know what, and I don't think that should be the point either. I think we should be electing people to go to Washington to do what we want them to do, not what they want to do.
The ballot in California is crazy. I used to live out there. The ballot's crazy in some ways everywhere, but California in particular. We talked about the irony that primaries seem more democratic, but they in many ways are not. Likewise, the fact that we have so many elections and so much government in the United States that's elected is also, ironically, not as democratic as it would appear. I mean, this is one of those things that I have changed my mind on over the years of studying this. But the bottom line is this. If I'm a common citizen, I can even be an informed citizen, and I get a ballot that's 3 pages long. All I'm going to do is go party, probably.
Yep.
If I may just not vote in certain races. I don't know. I mean, take a local example, which I find amusing. I don't know what the exact origins are, but we elect the county coroner in Alabama. So the county coroner, and we're not the only state that does this. You don't have to have any background at all. You can get a government job if you get elected to be a county coroner.
Nice.
So, and I don't want that gig, but whatever, right? But I mean, what's the qualifications? I mean, does it matter if I have a Republican coroner or a Democratic coroner? It makes no sense. We elect a lot of judges in this part of the country. Again, there's a whole long argument whether that's even a good idea, period, let alone do I really know whether, candidate X or candidate Y really is better at the job? I don't know. It becomes, like I said earlier, it partially becomes what name did I see on a poster? What commercial kind of convinced me that guy likes his family more than the other guy?
Yeah.
They're all having picnics,
Yeah, somebody had more money than the other candidate, so they got more signs out on lawns, and then suddenly everybody's thinking, well, they must be more popular because there's a lot more visibility.
Sure. So, I mean, it doesn't always work, but it often does. But the problem is with all of those people being elected, we just get swamped. And again, we don't know who really is responsible. We get confused, and we have always elections, and we don't give people time off to vote as it is. And we vote on Tuesday, which is kind of weird, again, exceptionally odd compared to most countries. We're having fights now about whether it should be easier or harder to vote. And the harder it is to vote, and the more elections you have, the fewer people are going to vote. That's just true. And so any argument about how many elections, how frequently we have elections, and how many people vote and how you get to vote are really all about turnout and about really who's motivated to show up. And when you get differing levels of turnout, you get differing levels of sort of the quality of the responsiveness that you're getting from the population.
Right.
And so we have a lot of choices, really long ballots. I can't anywhere. I mean, and maybe this is the other extreme, but in many unitary parliamentary systems, if you live in a country where most of the governing is done by the capital, you live in a smaller country, and you go vote, you cast one vote for the party that you prefer. That becomes who controls parliament, and then they form a coalition and elect they select the government, the prime minister, and they govern from there. And if they don't do a good job, you can vote differently next time because you've got multiple choices. And if someone really is messing up, you can go form another party and maybe try to compete. And again, I realize that life doesn't work always as well as theory suggests, but we certainly see these deficiencies in our system. I think if you ask many Americans, well, you only get to vote once, that's not very democratic. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be beholden to a party, but again, when you have a ballot that's literally 3 or 4 or 5 pages long, what other guide do you have? Your guide is obviously going to be well, I tend to prefer Republican, so I'm going to vote Republican. Or I'm going to just vote. In many states, you can still vote a straight ticket because that's easier. I know what I want for president, or I know what I want for governor, and I'll just vote that party, and that's all I'm going to do.
Right. I mean, there's so many contradictions in the system we have, and when we call ourselves the greatest democracy on the planet, I hope our listeners are beginning to get the idea that we actually have so many internal problems with the political system that it's hard to call ourselves a democracy, a functioning democracy, let alone the greatest one on the planet. And,
no, I mean, I struggle. I mean, I'll be honest, right? I mean, I do think we're still, okay, in the strictest definition, as academics do, we strip down and try to define things. It is true that we have a democracy in the sense that government is controlled, the state, the government itself is controlled by people who win elections. Mm-hmm. So that makes us democratic. Now, the problem becomes, though, what's the quality of that? And what's the quality of our representativeness? That's something that I get really focused on. How representative is this government, right?
Right.
I mean, I often, two quotes always come to mind. I can't remember if one may be in the book. One definitely isn't. There's this, and I never can figure out whether he actually said it or not, but there's this quote attributed to Churchill about democracy is the worst form of government there is, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time.
Right.
Which I think is true, right? I mean, in some ways, this dates back to Aristotle, who said the best kind of government is government by a wise, virtuous king. If you could find that guy, problem is those guys are A, hard to find, and B, their kids can be right bastards, so it never works out. So some kind of balance, he talks about a balanced constitutional system. So, I mean, democracy has all kinds of flaws. It's just, I can't think of a better way to do things if your goal is things like justice and human flourishing and freedom and all the things that go along with that, which I know are all contested terms, but nonetheless, they beat a lot of the alternatives. And the other one, I always think of Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a sort of satirical science fiction book that talks about that one of the major problems of governing people is trying to figure out who would you get to do it, because, people are a problem. That's what I always think of. People are a problem. But democracy is tough, right? Because we don't all agree. We don't all have somewhere. Our conceptions of justice are different. Our conceptions of politics are different. And we are self-interested in various ways. But trying to find a way to channel that, I think, it should be the goal. And I would like to think, but I've found it very frustrating as to how to make this argument, right? So, yeah, let's say we are the greatest democracy in the world for the sake of conversation for a moment. What does that really mean to people? Because it's one thing to say it, but is it really true, and how is it true? And do you simply mean that you get what you want? If that's the case, well, then maybe we're not so democratic. It certainly is the case, right, that, again, like I alluded to a little while ago, there are factions of people that benefit from the current system in a way that makes it very difficult to dislodge them from power. I mean, just forget even specifics. If I am a rural-oriented Republican, I am overrepresented in the Senate, period. And I maybe have other advantages. Therefore, I have advantages in electoral college, and I may have some advantages in the way in which House districts are drawn.
Meaning that person has more political sway than...
They have more political sway. So now they may be a wonderful person, they may be an awful person. That's not even the issue. The reality is they're not going to want to change things because they're privileged by the system. I mean, that's just human nature. Mm-hmm. And that becomes part of the difficulty in this conversation. And so what people tend to do is they tend to rationalize, right? They tend to rationalize why. I think it's part of why it's so difficult to dislodge people from, the founders, right? Well, the founders said this, the founders said that, they did this, they did that. Because if the system works to your advantage, then this appeal to sort of a mythical authority is advantageous. Which we talk about in chapter 1, which is one of my great bugaboos, we have a republic, not a democracy, which is a profoundly misunderstood concept. People deploy it all the time. I decided what they mean is they like the system in which they may mean multiple things, but I think a lot of people who use it are trying to hand wave away some of the injustice in the system, right? Like the electoral college. It's extremely difficult, in my opinion, to really make a strong argument for the Electoral College. The best argument I've come up with, and I've tried, is it is mostly mirrored the popular vote, therefore it's not that big of a deal. That's the best argument I can come up with. Because as long as it's just a messenger system that delivers the popular vote in some weird way, it's not that damaging. But the problem, of course, has become we've now had 2 popular vote inversions in the last 5 cycles. That's not good, right?
A result of the disproportionate representation of the Senate.
Yes, just straight up, right? Because the Senate allows certain states to have more electoral power than they should, relative to the number of people that live there.
Right.
Now, people argue that's because states have some special status, but that to me makes little sense in the sense that, states may have interests, but the only reason states have interests is because people live there. So it's the interest of the people that live there. So Wyoming as territory has no interest.
Yeah.
It's the Wyomings or Wyomingians or whatever they call themselves that live there that have interests. And they shouldn't have more power over the system, from my perspective as a democratic theorist, than a Californian or, or for that matter, or Texan or whatever the case may be, right? I mean, it's not just...
Yeah, we're all Americans. There's this thing about majority rule, the fear of majority rule, the rights of individuals, like individuals have to be protected from the majority somehow. I hear a lot that people don't want the majority to be in charge, but that's the definition of a democracy, is when the majority rule.
I mean, I would step further and say this. I would say that liberal democracy, which I mean in a theoretical sense, not in a policy outcome sense. I almost don't want to use the term liberal because it has particular connotations in American politics, but we talk about the literature of democracy. We talk about liberal democracy as being sort of the gold standard. Liberal democracy assumes a variety of things. One of the things it assumes is, on policy matters, the majority rules, right? But you can't, but there are built into liberal democracy a series of important protections that include protections for minority rights and individual rights, right? I should have the right to believe in whatever religion that I want to believe in, and the state should not be able to tell me otherwise, even if a majority of people don't like that religion.
Yeah, right.
Or I should be able to say certain things that offend other people, and the state should not be able to silence me. Okay, fine, right? It's the First Amendment and other things, and we can debate about what the boundaries ought to be on those things. Obviously, if I want to be a Mormon and not a Baptist, or a Buddhist instead of a Muslim, that's one thing. If I want to have human sacrifice in my backyard and claim religious freedom, well, that's a whole other problem, right? So I understand that we do draw boundaries around these things. But there have to be, and I totally acknowledge, and again, it's kind of funny, you listen to other people, talk to people who don't really have a comparative perspective, and they often think other countries don't have these things, but they do. They all have democracy on planet Earth that I would call a democracy that does not have some kind of protections for minority rights of the kind I just described, and others, as a matter of fact. Now, they're not identical. You mentioned the endless campaign season. And one of the reasons we have an endless campaign season is we do have a First Amendment that makes it very difficult to regulate those behaviors. Yeah. Now, in the UK, they can limit how long the campaigns last because there are free speech protections within British constitutionalism. There is no absolute First Amendment right like we have in the United States, for good or for ill. So they can say campaigns are 6 weeks or whatever the numbers. I think it is 6 weeks, and which would be, of course, fantastic.
That would be wonderful.
But, because so much noise, but nonetheless, and then part of its practice. I mean, the country that I initially started studying and wrote a book about, which is Colombia, which has all kinds of problems. But their presidential campaigns tend to be fairly short, and they have substantial protection in the Constitution. It's just a part of its practice and culture. We just, we're all over the place with all that kind of stuff.
The South American examples are really interesting, and I would love to talk about those at some point too. Our conversation is about the ability, or necessity anyway, of improving our political system, changing our constitution, to create a more democratic, more egalitarian, and more just political system in the United States. And I want to remind the listeners, too, that this is not just history or political science that we're talking about. I'm trying to isolate certain factors and ideas and circumstances, whatever, that have led to the collapse of a democracy in the United States. It's gotten to the point where almost everyone I talk to is very concerned about our political systems even holding together long enough, let alone functioning in a way which will get us through or into the 21st century in a productive, sustainable way. Like, I know I've had back and forth with Jim Hansen about climate change and suggesting to him that, and Bill McKibben, is our government capable of addressing the problems that you see, and they'll basically tell me they don't think so. Now they got the court to try to get some kind of judgment in their favor to make government accountable, for future generations. And it seems there's no end to the efforts that people are making to kind of tweak the system one way or the other to get it to function the way that they would like it to. But at the same time, there's very little discussion about actually changing the institutions and the dynamics and structures in our political system so that we have the machinery of government that actually works more effectively than what we have right now. And that's what I would like to impress upon everybody, is that this American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States has the best democracy in the world, is a charade. I mean, it's not the case that our democracy is it's exceptional in the sense that it is different in many ways. It may not be exceptional, but it's certainly not a great example right now. And it's the only one of its kind in the world.
Depending on what variable you want to talk about. I mean, if you talk about the broad brushstrokes of the structure, like we say in the book, if we look at veto gates, which is specifically the House, the Senate, and the presidency, there's several Latin American republics that are similar to the United States. And also that have federalism, which can also be a structural way to block policy. But they're not that many. Most have one or two. So policy is more difficult in our system than, say, in many European countries. That's true. I think what I would point to, and which would be my sort of view on the broader conversation. I mean, it's certainly the case that our system is not, it certainly is not as functional as it should be or has been or could be, with any doubt whatsoever. If we take that in a broad sense, whether it's just the policy making and policy implementing discussion that we have. I mean, just the amount of effort it took to get infrastructure passed is a good example of this, right? Because that really isn't, I mean, I recognize that how you pay for it and who gets it is a political argument, but it's not, I mean, in some ways it's shocking to me, not to get off on this too much, because I have another point I really want to make, but it's shocking to say President Trump wasn't able to just focus on building bridges, because who's going to argue with that? Instead, we went through all kinds of other nonsense. But that to me indicative of this weird place we are, right? That we can't even find this low-hanging fruit to govern around. Instead, we have strange fights and we make things difficult. But I think that what really concerns me as someone that studies these issues and continues to write about them is that I fully recognize that that no system is perfect, but there are less perfect and more perfect systems, I suppose. We talk about a more perfect union. Let's talk about a more perfect union in this sense.
We're beginning to find out that our beloved Constitution may have some serious defects. What if it turns out that's true? What are Americans to do about it? Is there a way we can peacefully change our Constitution in order to form a more perfect union? Is it even part of the national discourse? And if it isn't, why not? We'll find out in the next episode when we talk to Paul Street, author of They Rule.